I think it's part of every aspect of the business today is having that safety and protection of data is an essential part of what we do in our general operations of the business.
You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lip, Marketing Director at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technologies CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we are going to be talking about workplace safety in ways that you might not quite expect. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry. As we were trying to figure out this topic, we were talking about what is, you know, the theme of the month of June when you're going to be listening to this. And I was hoping that the discussion would be go to the beach and enjoy the weather would be our topic for discussion. But instead it's for Workplace Safety Awareness Month. Uh,
Yes.
so if you're on a beach right now, you can be thinking back at your work and hopefully everybody's being safe. But hopefully you're enjoying some time and vacation time this summer.
And so workplace safety, what do you think comes to mind for most business owners when we talk about that we might be delving into a little past to that?
I think it's probably physical safety, like slip and fall accidents. If you're manufacturing, thinking about machine safety, hard hat, just general safety protections. It could be if you're in a medical environment, having appropriate clothing and protection against diseases and things like that. So I think generally people think about that. I tend to think about our clients that are manufacturing that they have the sign on the wall. It's been X number of days since the last accident, hanging there. So I think a lot of business owners, think about physical safety and, slip and falls and those type of things. But I think it goes beyond that in today's digital world than just the physical side of things.
Yeah, and so as a tech company, when we're approaching workplace safety, maybe within our own company and when we're helping our clients, what are we looking at?
We're obviously looking at cybersecurity. Historically, 20, 30 years ago, when we were talking about technology and protecting technology infrastructure, we were more worried about the physical safety, locks and keys, protecting the server infrastructure from fire damage or water damage, theft, things like that. And certainly if you're still running servers and physical hardware in your environment that you want to protect, you got to consider that. And we've had a number of episodes on that, and we could dive into it a little bit more if we want. But I think more important than somebody breaking in your office and stealing your server, it's more likely that hackers are going to get into your environment. So cybersecurity, from a safety standpoint, is more important today for businesses than anything else they should be considering because technology and the information that you have stored on your computer systems and in the cloud is probably the biggest threat to most companies' operations if that goes down.
We've talked a lot about protecting businesses, but what about protecting the individual employees during cyber attacks? Where might they be most vulnerable? Could their information be leaked just as well as client information?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that come to mind right off the top of my head is thinking about direct deposits and financial fraud. So, one of the hacks that we're seeing going on right now a lot is illegitimate requests for direct deposit changes. So, a fake employee email comes in to HR and says, "Oh, I just have a new bank account. Please update my direct deposit payment, to this new account." And an unsuspecting payroll clerk or accounting person will go in and update the payroll system, and suddenly you're sending a paycheck to a hacker. So that's one of the threats, and certainly an employee not getting their pay is a big issue. I think the other thing is we as business owners really do need to protect our employees' data. We often have a lot of confidential data around our employees. So thinking about social security numbers, health insurance information, healthcare information, if you ever have to take a health census or from your employees, all that information, if it's stored unencrypted or transmitted unencrypted, is big information for hackers to garner data about your employees and launch an attack on your company or your employees individually. So it's really on us as employers to ensure that we're protecting our employees' data as much as we're protecting, our intellectual property or our clients' intellectual property. Our employees' information is, essential. I think it should be the first thing that we're protecting is their information.
And when it comes to a lot of times when you apply for a job, they are asking for a social security number right on an application. Do you recommend that, or do you recommend not collecting that kind of data until somebody's hired?
Yeah, at some point during the interview process, you have to collect the information if you're doing background checks or, an I-9 check, which, that we should be doing as employers. So at some point during the process prior to starting, you're going to need to collect things like social security numbers, et cetera. There are laws in certain states of not collecting some of that information just on the basic application. So, I would recommend waiting until, and in some states, not until a job offer is given to start collecting that information. So, don't take future employees' information lightly. Collecting that information puts a liability on the company too, especially if that information gets out. So, if you haven't updated your job applications for a while, it'd probably be a good time to talk to your attorneys or an HR specialist about what those requirements are, because states are often making changes to when you can collect that data and how to protect it. Certainly don't want, paper applications going, over PDFs on emails with social security numbers. The other thing, just talking to the general public too, is, anybody listening to this thinking about their own data, employers shouldn't be asking, for things like credit card information. That's a potential scam, having to pay to get a job. There was a news article I was reading that the news person was following along to figure out how this went, but the potential online employer was asking for, credit card information so that they, were charged for certain, features, and then they were supposed to get paid back for it. And, legitimate employers aren't going to do that. So, I think as a future employees, protecting your information and knowing what employers can ask for before getting hired is really important.
And do you find that businesses approach cybersecurity and this kind of, protective data as an operations issue or separate? And do you think it should be part of operations?
I think it's part of what we do every day inside our businesses. So, it should be, again, an essential part of not just, for the IT guy to figure out, but it should be part of the culture of the company. So, when any question that you're having about what data to collect and how to protect it should be part of normal operations of the company. You should have a culture around protecting, you know, employees' information, your own intellectual property, and your customer data and vendor data also. So, I think it's part of every aspect of the business today is having that safety and protection of data is an essential part of what we do in our general operations of the business.
When we were talking about this, we had kind of gone over like how has AI, because we've talked about a lot of these topics, but how has AI been changing this aspect of workplace safety?
Well, I think, one of the things that's happening, the deepfakes, AI generated scams that look really legitimate, voice duplication, things like that. If you're just counting on being able to visually see the person or talk to the person over the phone to authenticate somebody, it's kind of scary. So even your own employees could potentially, fall victim to an attack that's AI generated that looks and sounds like another employee in the company. So it's really important for everybody to have a second way to authenticate other than online about, specifically, like, I think financial fraud is a big part of it. So, you don't want to trust like a voicemail from, an employee requesting a wire transfer or, an ACH or direct deposit change. And it might sound exactly like them, but it could be a deep fake, which is really easy to do, unfortunately, with AI today. AI generated voices uh, near perfect, and even conversations are near perfect today too. So it's pretty scary, and you have to have a different way of ensuring that data is, protected and can be transmitted. So I really recommend to businesses today to think about, moving towards employee self-service so that they can enter their own data, like for the direct deposit changes, things like that, so that it's not going through a third party. And then if you are dealing with vendors or customers to change payment information or receipt of payment, having a self-service portal for them to do it is much better. And of course, protect it by multi-factor authentication so that hackers can't, get around just a username and a bad password. I think that's what we have to think about today is that, how to protect the data as much as possible and, safe operating of the data. And one of the ways to do that is that, self-service portals for people to do their own changes.
Yes, and I love the passkey as multi-factor authentication. That's my new favorite method of it. Do you do you like the passkey?
Yeah, passkeys are really useful, and we've talked about them in the past. If you have a, biometric or, other type of way to authenticate, and there's a token, which is a passkey, it is really higher security than just a username and password. So, and it's easier for the user too. So if you're using, fingerprint scanners on, keyboards or computers, biometrics, visual biometrics like on your mobile device, it's just so much easier than having to even use a password manager to store the usernames and passwords.
And getting back to deep fakes a little bit, have you found that people, I think I've heard about this, where somebody is posing as like a potential vendor and they go through a full meeting and they're really just trying to get you to buy to buy illegitimate or send them money because you think they're buying.
It's very interesting. I luckily I don't think any of our clients, and certainly here at Stimulus, we haven't experienced before, but I have read news stories about even, full teams meetings, them creating, websites, and it all appears legitimate, but you can put up an AI generated website in a few seconds and it looks perfectly legitimate. The company has history with, client references and everything like that. It could be generated within, minutes, like I said. And then an AI generated bot can attend meetings and interact, and it looks, potentially legitimate. So it's really it's even harder today to trust than it was even a few years ago with all the AI generation. And, I think it's one of the things that we are often thinking about is, how do you rebuild trust? And I think developing good interpersonal relationships, business networking, we've often talked about, from selling is more important today than it was a few years ago because there's just so much AI generated material out there, and now, AI sales and that kind of stuff is making it even scarier. So I think people want, personal contacts and, to make you feel comfortable before doing business with each other.
Is there technology being developed or maybe someone in existence for detecting these fake stuff?
There is, but it's, every time there's new technology, it's again, thwarted by better technology to fake. So, like for spam, for example, AI detection is the standard now for spam and email protection. But some stuff still gets by. It's not 100%. Now, certainly if you're using old, just heuristic based or key based spam protection, AI generated emails and are going to get right through that kind of stuff. So you have to have really good security. And it brings us back to what the protection was and what we were getting a few years ago. Yeah, it's an interesting and scary world that we live in, and it means we just have to be constantly changing and adapting. Kind of going back to the employee, I just had this thought. The scarier part for us as employers is to think about, could a AI employee apply for a job, get a job, and start working for you if you are like a fully remote company and you think that AI employee is doing everything what a real person would do. That would be interesting. They could interview, apply, interview, get the job, and actually do some work for you. And the hacker could get paid for being an employee, and then you could have tens of thousands of employees working out there, making real incomes. That's a scary thought.
I literally just I just had that same thought while you were talking. Like, what if what if there with all the remote stuff, like, what if there was a fake but, like, what if there was also, like, a fake me or you just, like, getting some other job as a as an AI version? How do we protect ourselves from getting duplicated?
Well, hopefully we're not there yet, and we won't be for quite a while, but strange world that we could live in, if that was the case.
So when it comes back into like hacking systems, what about like security mechanisms that are there, like cameras and fobs? Can that get hacked into? And how do we secure that?
Yeah, that's actually one of the areas that, concern us, especially older systems. So if you have, older camera systems, older access control systems, historically those have been exposed to the public internet so that you can, watch the cameras remotely or, update access controls, open doors, things like that. And older systems are can be compromised pretty easily, and if they do, they could watch what's going on in your office, disable cameras, maybe even use that as a jumping point to access internal systems, or even worse, they could potentially unlock doors and then physically break into your office pretty easily by disabling alarms and unlocking the doors. So I think it would be a good time to take the summer as we're thinking about security in the workplace and safety, is just take a look at any integrated systems, whether it's access controls, cameras, any type of smart building systems like HVAC controls, lighting, sensors, all that. A lot of those can get outdated and, be a jumping point for hackers to get into the system. So good idea to make sure that your firmware is up to date, that you have a security agreement on there, and have a cybersecurity company look at how those are being accessed and shut down controls so that hackers can't use that to either physically break into your building or potentially use that as a jumping point to get into your rest of your systems.
And how do we work with businesses on all these security systems? Do we directly work on those types of systems? Are we working with a vendor or both?
Generally, we work with a third-party vendor, so they, make a request to the company for some type of access. Usually, we put those type of systems on a separate, what we call VLAN or virtual LAN, and that protects the main system of the network from being able to be accessed through a compromised camera, for example. So, we'll work with the vendor, we'll set that up internally and ensure that there's protection between where your main data is and what's going on, the access control system. So it really is important that the vendor that's installing it, along with you as a owner and your IT and cybersecurity firms, are all coordinating to make sure that those systems are protected.
And to wrap it up, if somebody approaches us, a client or a potential client, with cybersecurity as their primary concern, where do we start?
Yeah, so an assessment is the first place to start. So, if you have a concern, or even if you don't have a concern, but something that we talked about today kind of brought an idea to you, we do a free cybersecurity assessment. So we'll interview you, walk through a bunch of questions, understand where your concerns are, understand what your systems are. And then we use a third-party tool and company that does the review. So they're the ones that control and review us to make sure that we're providing good service to our clients, and we're protecting our clients' data. And they do these audits for us also. So if you're interested in that and you're viewing online, you can scan the QR code. We'll also put the link in the show notes. But be happy to provide an assessment of where you're at, whether or not you have a concern or not. It's always good to have another party take a look at it. I think Sherry, you shared an experience before we got on the call that you had some work done or that you thought needed to be done in your house, and somebody came along and gave a different proposal, which was far different and better. So it's always good to have a second set of eyes, right?
Definitely. Always get at least one other opinion, if not a couple.
For sure. So hopefully you're enjoying this at the beach, not sitting at your desk like we are, but be safe out there this summer and enjoy this the beautiful weather you're experiencing.
Yes, definitely. We covered some very immediate topics and then some a little further out that, but people are still concerned concerned about it all. So thank you, Nathan, and thanks everybody for listening or watching.